Chapter 2. Jerry's knuckles tightened on the wheel as he approached the Smith murder house. All traces of early morning exhaustion flew from his mind. He hated the place and didn't want the first thing to do with it. Didn't want the first thing to do with that scummy Channel 9 producer Gary. But when a man needs money, a man needs money. And money just wasn't in Monroe real estate at that point in time. So when that greasy bastard from Channel 9 called Jerry in hopes of sniffing around the murder house and offered to throw in $50, well, it was tempting, though ill-advised. The last time a piece of real estate owned by Hammer and Croft had appeared in a Channel 9 special, the owners had thrown a big fit. They'd threatened to fire the person who had allowed the televised demonstration of questionable construction whenever they figured out who that person was. Fearing for his job, Jerry had told himself he'd put the brakes on working with reporters for a little while. The murder house was different, though. Because there was no renting or selling the Smith place, there was a lot of talk about tearing the house down and renovating the sizable acreage around it into something like an outlet mall. Red tape was the issue. The residence was far from the heart of civilization and accessed by a few very dodgy roads in need of repaving, to say nothing of the trees to be felled. Once the necessary changes were made, however, it would be a wholesome satellite of Monroe that would gradually fill in with apartments, suburbs, and other small businesses until it seemed to be one pre-planned, unbroken town end to end. From one shopping mall where Smith kidnapped his victims to the other, where he killed those victims. Jerry was overcome with a shudder as his car crawled to a stop before the rusted old gate. There was a certain symmetry in it. What would the victims have thought of these plans? He wasn't sure they would appreciate it, personally. What did Jerry, the real estate agent, know about dead kids? He barely knew how to close. Pulling his coat tight against a bracing bluster of pre-dawn wind, still sharp despite imminent spring, Jerry fiddled with his keyring until he found the set he'd stolen from the office. Whatever the victims would have felt about the sight of their murders being plowed over with the parking of a place selling irregular coach purses to drivers from the highway, he had a feeling they'd want one last shot at expressing their pain. After all, it was one thing to read about the Smith house or hear the case's details from your neighbor. It was something very different to see the building in pictures or film, and something altogether worse to see in person. The facade brooded high above him, its every surface rotten and unkempt with the warping of years spent in neglect even before the Ripper's arrest. Averting his eyes from the eerie windows, the real estate agent told himself that $50 for unlocking a house was a sweet deal. He hurried up the creaking stairs of the front porch and unlocked the door, letting it swing wide to reveal the place before he stepped inside. The day was a little cloudy, with no sunlight to shine in. Jerry dug through his pockets for his flashlight and let its high beam tell the tale. Even with the light lending distinct shape to chairs and lamps and dusty end tables, Jerry somehow found the place looked black. His eyes read it all as black, as veiled in a fine miasma that drained everything of color. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe he was letting his head run away with him. Jerry had kids of his own, after all. His kids and Gary's went to the same private school, which was how he had first been subjected to the producer's forceful personality. And yet, despite having those kids, Gary had talked so casually on the phone about the murder house piece, like it was nothing, like it was fiction, like 11 children hadn't died right there in that bleak, terrible house. Trying not to think of how truly nightmarish it would be for anyone to spend their last waking day, hour, minute, second, in a place like the Smith house, Jerry swallowed hard and swept the flashlight beam along the wall. Upon finding a switch, he hurried to it and flicked it back and forth. Damn! And he'd called the electric company beforehand. The real estate agency had been paying the bill more or less automatically while they debated whether to put money into renovation or demolition. The problem was probably internal to the house, then a fuse. God forbid, some wire in some wall somewhere. Annoyed now, having ridden in this rodeo a few too many times, Jerry cast the beam of the flashlight around the dusty room, coughed a few times, and made his way in a promising direction. Kitchens were usually a good place to start. Sure enough, Jerry found a door to the basement arranged around the corner from the sink. Sighing, he peered into the darkness that overwhelmed stairs tested by his flashlight's beam. Something moved on the edge of the light and pulled itself out of sight. Alarmed, Jerry leapt back to brandish the beam in the direction of the movement. Hello? The flashlight caught nothing, of course. All the same, he clutched his chest through his shirt. His heart pounded so fast it almost hurt. Jerry closed his eyes. Damn rats. Damn murder house. Damn Gary. Forget $50. Jerry was going to meet that son of a bitch at the door and tell him it was $150 or no deal. Between the risk to his career and his cardiac health, his time was increasing in value. The fuse box in the cluttered basement seemed to be missing a fuse altogether. This would be a problem for that idiot and his camera crew. Groaning, the real estate agent rubbed his hand over his forehead and marched right back up the stairs. The kitchen was cramped and disorderly, probably due to, in no small part to teens breaking in to mess around. How they got through, more likely over, the gate, now that was the question. Hammer and Croft really needed to get it together. Shaking his head and sorting through drawers, Jerry said to himself, "No wonder I can't close the sale these days. Who wants to even hear about these leads?" At last, he located a pen and very old pad of paper whose leaves were ringed with cheerful illustrations of milk, sugar, and eggs. With the flashlight held in his mouth, Jerry scribbled a note for the television crew. Somewhere in the house, something slammed. His heart bracing itself against his ribs, Jerry stopped writing and looked around. His ears strained through the silence in pursuit of the faintest noise. "Gary? That you?" Nothing but his own voice echoed through the empty property. Lips pursed, Jerry finished his note, tore it from the pad, and set it on the spot of the kitchen counter that seemed the most obvious. Satisfied, he dusted off his hands. Jerry made his way back through the empty living room, past the sheet-covered furniture, and between a few abandoned cardboard boxes. The very floorboards fell silent beneath his feet. The Easter Ripper came screaming around the corner of the front hallway. No, that was Jerry's scream. It rose high and desperate, warbling with the knowledge of death even before the empty-eyed rabbit drew back its sickle. Jerry gagged, astonished as his own blood splattered across the matted pink fur of the demon's bulbous head. As his intestines slid out, Jerry reflexively caught them, cradling them back against his body as though they were an infant child. Thrown off balance by the unspeakable agony as his organs, heavier than he would have thought, and felt as though liable to tug out his spine, he careened down to his knees and marveled that he didn't feel the slice itself. It was everything else that he felt before he lost consciousness. The burning sting and pulling cramp of the exposed viscera, pulsing fresh blood and working flesh in his hands, the gaping open of his stomach wound, the paw of the rabbit that bent to turn him over.